Welcome to the Exponential Australia Church Leaders Podcast. We are so glad that you would join us today as we continue to hear from a wide range of Aussie and global specialists and practitioners when it comes to multiplication and church planting. But before we jump into our episode today, we wanted to take a quick moment to tell you about our sponsor for this podcast, the Church Co. The Church Co is a website and app platform specifically designed for and with churches and church planters in mind. And the best part is that they actually build the website and app for you, so you don't have to spend exorbitant amounts of time, money, and energy learning a new tool. You might think that this would cost a whole bunch, but they are a ministry. And the price is similar to hosting a website at simply $29 a month. Also, the best part is that they are based here in Australia. So they understand the Aussie church and are building amazing tools with and for the Australian church in mind. So we want to strongly encourage you to check out the Church Co, as well as some promotional opportunities that we have with them. That's all from us for now, and we hope that you enjoyed this fortnight's episode of the Exponential Australia Church Leaders Podcast.
Well, hello and welcome to the Exponential Australia Church Leaders Podcast. We are so glad that you would join us again today as we hear from a wide range of leaders, communicators, and authors and leaders when it comes to multiplication and church planting and the different issues that are facing and confronting us in this world. And today we're joined by a very special guest by the name of Steve Cuss. Steve is an Aussie based in the US. We are so glad that he will join us from across the sea today as he shares particularly around some of his focus upon leadership anxiety as well as family systems theory. But Steve, that is a really big thing to start with. I want to, before we even jump to the subject nature of your books and your focus and your area of expertise, whether you'd first just give us a bit of a thumbnail sketch of who you are, where you come from, how you find yourself in the US. Give our listeners a bit of an introduction to who you are today.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, Charlie, great to be with you. Yeah, born and raised in Perth. All of my extended family were wheat and sheep farmers, but we were city. And so I spent a lot of time in the city out in the country, and grew up unchurched, like very unchurched. None of my extended family, except my sister and I, are followers of Jesus. And my sister had a friend in high school. She happened to be the new preacher's daughter at a local Church of Christ in Perth, Wembley Church of Christ. And her name was Elaine. She was just a natural relational evangelist, just very relational, very conversational. And she led my sister to Christ and a bunch of their friends. They formed a youth group that was full of these unchurched kids. And then several of them kind of reached down to their siblings. And I was the kid brother. And so, I became a Christian. God changed my life. I was a Christian 14 or 15 years of age. There's all kinds of story there. My parents, I think, probably thought that we'd joined a cult because they were classic Aussie, agnostic, don't want anything to do with anything fanatical. So they wouldn't let me get baptized for a year. And in that particular time in the Churches of Christ, getting baptized was a big deal, and getting baptized the right way, that's the only way you're going to go. So talk about like checking the road both times before you cross. Because I took a year before I was allowed to get baptized, and then I felt a call to ministry right after high school, and then decided to explore theology in the States. So one of my preaching heroes is an American named Fred Craddock. And so I went to the university where he was a professor in Knoxville, Tennessee. And always thought I'd come home. Met and married an American. We were looking at moving back to Australia. She knew by marrying me that we'd be anywhere in the world. And when we were expecting our first child was when I got my first full-time ministry after chaplaincy, and we couldn't move. So we've been here ever since.
Incredible. And of course, today we'll be talking about a whole wide range of things, particularly focusing upon some of your written work and, particularly, I guess, what you've become known for as an author and as a speaker. And you also host your own podcast as well, which I'd encourage any of our listeners to go and listen to as well. But particularly in the area of leadership anxiety and family systems theory, of which I think is obviously not a new phenomenon. It's been around for a long time, and yet it's definitely got a lot more public understanding or acceptance in the last 5 years, I think, given what we've all gone through with the pandemic and realizing just how anxious the world is, internally anxious church systems can be. I wonder for our listeners today, maybe this is a brand new concept. Maybe that there has been some popularization of this idea over the last couple of years. Maybe give us, firstly, how did you stumble into this world of where this has become obviously a passion of yours? And secondly, give a bit of a sketch as to what that is as a bit of a 101 for our listeners.
Yeah, if you don't mind, Charlie, I'll answer it opposite. But
sure,
because I think systems theory at its simplest is you learn to notice the spread of anxiety. That's all it is. You can go into any environment, and rather than catching what's going on, you can notice what's going on in you. Like most of us as leaders don't know when we're anxious, particularly Aussies. We don't think we're anxious. Like
that's true.
The entire Australian culture is sending the message of, I'm relaxed, you'll be right, So I think we do have trouble locating our anxiety. And so it teaches you to walk into any room, notice the anxiety. Then it gets really interesting because then you start to realize, okay, the minority of the people are generating the majority of the anxiety. You can learn how to notice who's generating it, who's carrying it, what micro adjustments are those people making to keep everything going. So if you look at some of these famous leaders that have had these very big scandals, what you will see almost every time is that famous leader was generating massive levels of anxiety on the team. But because they were famous and their ministry was so apparently thriving, the team is making these little micro adjustments to keep everything kind of going. Systems theory helps you notice it, name it, diffuse it, change it. It's really powerful. So that's what it is. And I was introduced to it as a hospital chaplain.
Wow.
Systems theory was founded in the late 50s by Murray Bowen. And my chaplain boss was one of Bowen's first ever students.
Incredible.
So he took some of Bowen's earliest, even before Bowen had really set out his 8 concepts, George was taking studies under him. And so he taught us. And I found it to be so helpful in surviving trauma chaplaincy.
Wow.
Because I had all this anxiety coming at me from obviously people in the worst moments of their life. But what I didn't realize is, for example, my anxious need to make people feel better, was getting activated by being in the room with screaming people. So, yeah, that's how I learned about it. And it just made so much sense to me. And so then I chased it through grad school. And I think I've read just about anything anyone's ever written on it. And including, the Systems Institute in Sydney is world-class.
Okay.
Jenny Brown, she's not there anymore, but she's a world-class systems teacher. So right in your backyard, Charlie, you've got some great assets there.
Incredible. And I know particularly with, the popularization of the idea, people like, John Mark Comer and Mark Sayers, who recently released Non-Anxious Presence, which was a really, significant popularization of that idea, introducing people to what it means to be a non-anxious presence in this world, in our ministry, on behalf of the kingdom of God. I wonder for those, again, who are quite new to this idea, if you'd give a bit of a sketch as to how this can impact churches. Because, of course, when we hear the word anxiety, we might immediately think of a psychological condition, rather than kind of the inherent anxiety that we can and do all feel from time to time. And how that can...
That's a really important question.
Yeah, that can begin to affect church, I'm particularly thinking about the wide range of emotional and complicated relationships that exist in any organism or organization. How would that begin to then affect a church community? And how is it so important that a leader or leaders are aware of that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. The problem is, we're all it's good that we're all talking about anxiety more. That's a really good thing. The problem is we keep talking about it as a singular thing, but the best way to understand anxiety is plural. There's all these different kinds of anxieties. So bipolarity, for example, is not a field I can help with at all, but it's a real anxiety.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about, at least in Western Australia, the tiger snake is a big deal. Do you have tiger snakes in Sydney? I should know this.
Yeah, we do. I think they're all around Australia and they're particularly aggressive.
Right, yeah, very aggressive. So in Western Australia, mostly you'll come across the dugite. Occasionally you'll see a death adder. They're pretty shy, but the tiger will have a go at you. It kind of came out of the womb grumpy. So, when you're being chased by a tiger snake, that's what's known as acute anxiety.
Yeah.
That's like, I need to get to safety as fast as I can. But my field is chronic anxiety. What's fascinating about it is it's not based on a real threat. It's based on a false threat. So you get anxious and your body kind of tells you that you're in danger or under threat when you're not. Yeah. So, if I see a tiger snake, I get a big dose of adrenaline. My brain gets really clear. But chronic anxiety, it's not a big dose. It's just a steady drip, drip, drip. This is why leaders burn out. And that's because our false needs feel real in the moment. I can go through the 5 core false needs, but one of mine would be people pleasing. A lot of people in ministry are also people pleasers. Well, making people happy is a false need, but by golly, in the moment, it feels as real as can be. And so chronic anxiety is a deceiver. It tends to trick you. So there's a big and complicated conversation, because then if you look at another kind of anxiety, which is like trauma is complicated because it's real and false together. Like that thing really happened to you, but the meaning you've made from it isn't real. So you work with people in trauma who haven't processed their trauma, and their safety radar is kind of looking around saying, I'm not safe here, when they are. But chronic anxiety, maybe the simplest way to see it is a perfectionist. Perfection is a source of chronic anxiety. If a perfectionist made a mistake, like maybe they put a spelling mistake on an email, that's really not a big deal. But to a perfectionist, it's kind of the end of the world. And that's chronic anxiety in a nutshell. It's your body and your beliefs telling you that Armageddon's about to happen when it's not. So then you take a church planter. I've never met a church planter that doesn't take the health of the church personally. And that may not always be the case, Charlie. That may not be you, but like if someone criticizes the church, the planter feels criticized personally. Very personal. The well-being of the church and your well-being. In systems theory, we would call that enmeshed, that planters have an enmeshed and over-functioning relationship with the well-being of the church. That's going to wear you out. That's going to destroy your well-being, your relationships. The other challenge that's kind of related is every pastor wears at least 2 hats with everyone they know, whereas most healthy relationships are single hat relationships. So you got your friends, but in church, they're not just friends. They're also volunteers or donors. It gets really complicated. With my elder board, I had one elder. He was a dear friend of mine. He was my boss, and then I became his boss. That's weird. And so all these hats that we're both, he's not the problem. We've both had all these hats, but too many hats will wear you down. So there's a lot there. I'm happy to chase any of it, but that's kind of it in a nutshell.
And again, that's all been kind of like brilliant stuff that's come to the surface in the last couple of years. And thank the Lord that people like Cicero and others have also been talking about things like that, because this idea of differentiation is an idea that may still be foreign to many people, but is becoming more popularized as to, I could eat a barbecue on Saturday with friends from church, and yet before I know it, I'm getting grilled over something that's happening in the life of the church, but I'm there as Charlie, I'm not there as the pastor. And yet that can bring on a whole wave of anxiety in the life of, leaders, pastors. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the questions I'll ask a pastor is, how many minutes a week can you be exactly yourself?
Mm-hmm.
Exactly what you just described. You're at the barbecue, your pastor hat is hung up. It's gone.
Yes.
And then someone says something and you're like, let me go get my hat. You kind of feel hijacked. So it's a really important question for pastors. How many minutes a week can I be exactly myself? How many minutes a week can I be God's child and not God's employee?
So good.
Systems theory and anxiety gets really complex and really sophisticated, but you can also look at it at the simplest level of input and output.
Mm.
And most leaders, just as a general rule, too much output, not enough input. We are not good at receiving the gospel that we proclaim to others.
Mm.
So there are some real basics, Charlie, on relaxing into God's presence, enjoying the gifts of God rather than giving them away. Too many of us are, Bernard of Clairvaux, early church father, he actually said, don't be more generous than God is.
Wow.
He was talking to ministers. That's pretty provocative.
Absolutely.
Modern ministers hear that, were like, that can't be okay. But Bernard was saying, he says, the problem with humans is we're all canals. We just, everything that comes in pours out. And he said, God's a reservoir. There's always plenty. And he's just loving over it's a beautiful vision. So a lot of us are too anxious because we simply don't have enough minutes in the week where we can be exactly ourselves. Our hat is off. We're seen and loved and known without pretense and without performance. It's a big piece of it.
Yeah. And I think what also comes to my mind, particularly for church leaders and church planters in particular who are listening to this, is particularly in the early stages of pioneering anything, whether it be a business or whether it be a church, it is such an all-of-life investment. It takes over everything. Unless you're careful, it can take over your marriage, your family. It can take over any sense of Sabbath or rest. And, the question that comes to my mind, Steve, is particularly around how can, of course, there is this great need to, in a healthy way, sacrifice for the kingdom and do great things for the Lord. But what are ways that maybe pioneers can still be palpably aware of that anxiety that may be going on within them? Because a whole bunch of that drive can also come from some really unhealthy places, whether it be trying to prove someone wrong, a wound from a parent. It can be a whole range of things that actually they can be so driven or so all of life invested for a whole bunch of reasons that maybe aren't even before them or the gospel.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I think it's healthy for all of us in ministry to go back to our call and find the dysfunction in it.
Yeah.
I want to be careful what I'm saying here. I believe God called me to ministry. I don't believe But I don't believe it was only that God called me into ministry. I also think I've got some wounds and some areas in my life that I need. I remember, Charlie, at my sister's 21st birthday, she asked me to give a speech. I was 17. My whole childhood and teenagehood, I felt stupid. I never felt good at anything. I was terrible at sports. I was a very average student. Didn't know how to make a girl laugh. That's the game. When you're a high schooler, that's the whole game.
Yeah.
My sister asked me to give a speech at her 21st, and I dearly love my sister. She's an amazing person in my life. And I kind of like in stand-up comedy, they'd say I destroyed, like I nailed it. People were laughing. I was telling funny stories. I was telling moving stories about my sister. I'd never really done anything like it before, and I absolutely, well, you better believe that my heart made a little agreement about getting on a stage again.
Yeah, wow.
But I didn't realize that until several years into preaching. And so then my well-being was enmeshed with my preaching performance. And so I do think going back to your call and finding the dysfunction in it is a really healthy exercise. It does not discount the holiness and call of God, but it keeps you out of trouble, I think, because we all are attracted to ministry for light and dark reasons.
Yeah.
Most of us, we can find our anxiety on the other end of our gift.
Yeah.
Whatever gifting God has given us, the twisting of it is our anxiety. So I agree, church planning is an all-consuming affair. Therefore, all the more reason to not be more enmeshed and over-functioning than you need to.
Yeah. Yeah. And you've just raised some great points there, Steve, even around like, particularly when it comes to it being an all-of-life affair, and often we're trying to impress people. We're trying to make it look like maybe we're more polished than we actually are. We're trying to put on a pretty good facade when it comes to the church, our own leadership in ministry. I wonder if you could speak just to how significant it is to have those significant outlets. I mean, you talked about just kind of being in God's presence and receiving and celebrating the gifts of God, but also to be your true self to a small circle of people and how significant that can be. Because so many pastors do feel like I need to always wear the mask. I need to always be on. And yet to have people that you can really bear some of those stories of which you've kind of shared today around, I realize that there's some stuff going on internally and under the hood that maybe isn't best for my ministry.
Yeah. I'll tackle this on two levels. First of all, I do cast a vision for brutally honest pastoring instead of pretentious pastoring. So, and I lived it, Charlie. When I became the lead pastor, I did not plant a church. I came in after the planter wore out. I was the second guy in. And I said to the elders, I'd been in ministry for 10 years. I'd never been a lead pastor before. I said to the elders, I don't know what I'm doing. Let's just tell everybody. So when I was installed as the pastor, we just played our hand. Hey, this young guy comes with good references. He's never done it. It's going to take him 3 to 5 years to grow into the role. Be patient. He's preached a lot, but he's never preached every week before. He's going to learn to preach every week in front of us. Now, what that does, you might think, that's not leadership. Oh, yes, it is. Because what it does is it attracts the church shoppers leave right away. They just want a good show, they're gone, which you can't pull off when you're a church plant. So do me a favor, get out of here. What it leaves is it leaves amazing people and it leaves bullies. That's who it leaves behind. It leaves authentic people who are hungry to grow, and some of them will follow your leadership and some of them will lead you. And so to me, the fallacy of the pastor is that we're always the leader. We're not. So I lead some of the people in my church and have been led by some of the people in my church. And so my job isn't to lead everybody. It's to create vision and clarity so that we can all lead and follow. My job is not to care for everybody. It's to create a culture where everyone can care, receive and give and receive care. Now, the bullies, those become a problem. Some people are attracted to that kind of vulnerability, and that's the downside. So I would just make a case to a church planter not to feel any pressure to be something other than what you are, and just lay that out. This is what I am. This is who we are. We would love you to be part of it. Boy, do we need you. I just told you my weaknesses. If you can help, come on, let's go. And you will attract some of the most amazing, unpretentious people. It's incredible. And, I've got a 16-year track record of that now. The second part of the question, I think if your average leader can have their ministry hat off 15% of the time, I don't mean when you're sleeping or home with your spouse. I mean 15% of the time of your kind of 60-ish hours a week, you are enjoying the gifts of God, not giving them to others. So we encourage people to create a life-giving list. They can go to my website and download a spreadsheet where we teach you how to do it. And I encourage people to cultivate 8 to 12 life-giving habits every day, where you're just enjoying God's goodness every day in these little micro moments. And that really builds your resilience for ministry.
Yeah, I would suggest that's definitely a word in season, Steve, for a number of leaders and our listeners, and definitely for myself as well, that's something that we all need to return to. And we just want to encourage, of course, in any pursuit of advancing the kingdom and planting churches, we want it to be done in a way that honors Jesus and honors his kindness to us in the way that we do that. Steve, I want to turn our attention now particularly to some of the books that you have written. In 2019, you released Managing Leadership Anxiety, and you are about to release, or have released at time of the release of this podcast, The Expectation Gap, of which I want to hear about. You particularly been able to apply some of these concepts of emotional health and family systems theory and the things that we've talked about already today to leadership and to a spiritual lens in terms of what it means to be a fully formed follower of Jesus. I wonder if you'd kind of give us just some insights on particularly the expectation gap, because I know that's something you're talking about and thinking about a lot at the moment.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So what I've done is I've tried to take some of the best parts of systems theory and run our faith experience through it. So I think what's going on is I think we all have these beliefs about God that we don't actually experience much in our body. So a lot of us believe it in our brain, but our body doesn't believe it. So I believe in the peace of Christ, but I'm not at peace. I believe in the freedom in Christ. I'm bound. And where it gets really personal is, I believe in God's love, but I'm better at proclaiming it than receiving it. I believe in God's presence, but I don't see it. And then the third gap would be, I just thought I'd be further along in my faith by now. I just thought I'd be better Christian than I am.
Yeah.
So I tackle these three gaps, and I try to show us the dynamics that are going on that under the surface. If we don't tackle these dynamics, we're just always going to run into the same gap. One of the great gifts of systems theory is it teaches you not to address problems, but to address your attempted solutions to problems. It's kind of a shift.
Yeah.
So maybe the simplest example would be if you've ever tried to get a kid out the door in the morning for school on time.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, that's a recurring, predictable pattern. So systems theory teaches you to notice recurring, predictable patterns. And then once you've noticed the pattern, like, oh man, every morning he's late, every morning. But yet every morning you act surprised that he's late, even though he's always late, you're like, oh, you're late again, as if, come on. But systems theory helps you get out of the anxiety to see it. And then the best part is what you want to do is you want to blame your kid. But systems theory says, no, don't blame. What are you doing that's making it worse? And that's your attempted solution. Now, every leader I know has problems in their churches, and they get frustrated with critics and elders. But what they're not aware of is how much their own attempted solution is keeping it going. So when I worked with a children's pastor once, and I said, what's the problem? And she said, all of these people canceling Saturday night. They cancel last minute. We're stranded Sunday morning. Very common problem in children's ministry. I said, well, what are you doing about it? Which is, I'm asking, what's your attempted solution? She said, I tell everyone, that's no problem. Because she doesn't know how to tell people, oh no, because she's anxiously needing approval. She has this false need of making everyone feel okay. So she said, no wonder they're canceling. I make sure they know it's not going to impact us at all, even though it really does. Yeah. There's an attempted solution. So when it comes to like the way we read our Bible, I don't know, Charlie, like, if you think about Peter walking on water, that great story in Matthew, what we don't realize, what we do is we're trying to turn our whole congregation into Peter that week when we preach. Have you ever heard a sermon where somebody says, this week you should be Thaddeus, like stay in the boat? And when you hear that, you're like, well, that's not how are we going to grow people's faith? Well, wait a minute. One dude got out of the boat. 92% of the disciples stayed in the boat. I don't know anything about Thaddeus. The reason we focus on Peter is we know so little about the disciples. We have to preach the ones we know something about. And we actually don't know much about Peter either. So what ends up happening is, let's say Thaddeus, I mean, I'm getting into the world of theory here, but let's say Thaddeus is a risk assessor. Let's say you have a congregant who's an insurance adjuster. And their whole wiring is when someone says, I'm going to take a step, their first move is to open a computer and open a spreadsheet and list the pros and cons. Let's say that Thaddeus had his spreadsheet and he was still filling it out by the time Peter got back in the boat. Here's my question. Can that guy still be a great follower of Jesus? Yes, he can. But he has to sit through so many sermons where we're just squeezing more faith out of this poor dude. The other thing is, Jesus did not equate walking by faith with Peter. We do that. The story is actually not about Peter at all. It's about that Jesus is a Genesis 1 creator God, which is why he's miraculously over the elements. If you go back and read that story, Peter says, if that's you, tell me to come. And all we get from Jesus is one word, come. We put assumption onto the text. Maybe Jesus said, come, and for 2,000 years, people will use you as an example of walking by faith. Or maybe Jesus said, oh man, every time Peter's about to do something, something fun happens. Let's go, man. We don't know. We don't know. Now, of course, Peter sank and Jesus said, oh, you of little faith. But the next week we come to church and now we're preaching about Mary sitting at the feet of Jesus instead of Martha scurrying around. And now we're telling our people, you should be more like Mary, more like Mary. So one week we're supposed to be courageous like Peter. The next week we're supposed to be contemplative like Mary. Peter and Mary are nothing like each other. And we're telling our people to be like both of them.
Wow.
I think we as leaders and our people are under a heavy yoke that Jesus is not calling us to be under. So that's just something we get into in the book.
I love that, Stephen. There's so much in that I think we could dive into today. And of course, I'd encourage any of our listeners that have kind of had their curiosity piqued and their thirst wet to go and read that, because that's something I definitely want to go and dive into. I guess the final question that I'd really like to take us to today, Steve, is around, I guess, reactivity. When we talk about anxiety and leadership anxiety, often one of the tendencies in leaders can be to react rather than to respond. And of course, the great heart of Exponential is to see a response both to God and also to the great needs of our time in Australia, plant more churches. And yet sometimes when we see, whether it be younger leaders, whether we see the church down the road, there's a level of reactivity and comparison that can go on that is really an anxiety in the life of a leader.
Yeah.
And particularly as we consider what we hope and pray over the next decade in Australia will be more churches planted. I wonder if you could speak to, I mean, it's an old adage and we've all heard it before, that the best leaders are the most secure leaders. And if we're going to see more churches planted, it's going to require some really secure leaders, both in terms of releasing younger leaders, sending a sum of people and money down the road to plant a church to reach a new people group. I wanted just to finish our time, if you could speak to responding rather than reacting, and how we all can play a role in that when it comes to leadership anxiety.
Yeah, it's a great question. I do think particularly young leaders just carry more pressure than God has asked them to carry. And it's all of this expectation. If you look in the scriptures, most of the great followers of God were exactly themselves. And I think that really is the secret, to be exactly a human-sized leader of a supernatural God. I think pastors, we try to be a supernatural pastor. We try to do God's job. Turns out, Charlie, the 5 core false needs of humans are also the 5 attributes of God.
Wow.
And so what happens is we're striving to be more than God has asked us to be, which is human-sized. Yeah, that's why I shared the story about getting up in front of the congregation and saying, I'm a rookie, because I was. Why would I pretend to be a spiritual guru? I think I was 33 when I started that. Why do that? That's too much pressure. Not only is the pretense not good for the congregation, it's not good for my soul. But just to show up and be exactly myself, that doesn't mean that I get away with bad behavior. It actually gives me the freedom to make mistakes, repent.
Yes.
If you look at some of these more high-profile cases of fallen pastors, it's like they've forgotten that they can repent. They have to maintain some kind of an image, but the image is gone. Like, we pulled the card, the deck has fallen.
Yes.
Thank God. Now you can be a human.
Yeah.
But so I just think for young leaders, let's just start that way, be human-sized. I think there's great power, Charlie, in whether it's some congregants or some good friends getting in a circle and just saying, here is exactly what you do that no one else can do. Like, here is your gift from God, what you're good at. And that, to me, is the source of your authority as a leader. You know, someone like a Mark Sayers, I think he's one of the finest Christian brains in the world. He is, I find Mark to be remarkable, phenomenal. It's not a secret, but many people don't know he struggles with bipolarity. And so you look at a guy like Mark and you say, okay, this is what makes Mark a gift in the kingdom.
Yes.
But if he tried to be, I don't know how to compare Mark to someone, but you know, like this big charisma, big event, rah-rah, high vision, it wouldn't work.
Yeah.
But I say, thank God for Mark Sayers. We need him to be exactly the way he is. What a gift that is. So I think the sooner you can relax into being whom God made you to be, it actually keeps you out of trouble, because then you can work on your character, your rough edges. You're free to be human instead of impressive, all of that stuff.
Yeah. Steve, you've given us a multitude of things to really chew on today, and we so appreciate the time that you've taken and your incredible level of expertise. Again, we just want to encourage our listeners to go and grab hold of one of Steve's book, if not both of them, and have a read of those, because I think we've only just scratched the surface of what it means to truly consider the implications of leadership anxiety on the church and here in Australia, and given us so much to think about. Steve, I want to thank you so much for being on our podcast today.
Yeah, Charlie. Yep, good to be with you.